I have filed, across 11 years of compact protocol service, 4,017 witness notations. The number is not remarkable. A senior protocol observer, embedded with a Grade 2 diplomatic delegation, will average somewhere between 300 and 400 notations per year, depending on the volume of the delegations to which they are assigned and the legal complexity of the planetary jurisdictions through which those delegations move. 4,017 over 11 years is a record of moderate diligence and almost total invisibility. I was never cited for an exceptional notation. I was never formally reprimanded for a deficient one. I was, in every professional sense, exactly what a compact protocol observer is supposed to be. A person standing at the edge of a room, watching, recording, filing, and otherwise failing to exist in any way that the people in the center of the room could find inconvenient. I was good at it. I want to be clear about that before I explain what happened on Sethari, because I am aware that the story I am about to tell does not make me look like a careful or temperate man. I was careful. I was temperate. I had spent 11 years building a record so unmarked that my supervising bureau chief, a man named Tolvenkas, who has since retired to the outer administrative belt, once described my notation file as the cleanest instrument panel I have reviewed in 30 years of service. He meant it as a compliment. I accepted it as one. I was not until Sethari a person who used instruments recklessly. The job requires a specific kind of personality, and I should tell you what that kind is, because it matters to understanding what I did. A compact protocol observer is not an investigator. They do not uncover things. They do not build cases or pursue leads or exercise initiative in any direction that the roles governing regulations have not explicitly mapped in advance. What they do is this. They stand in the physical presence of formal proceedings and ensure that what is recorded about those proceedings is accurate. That is it. The job's entire value lies in its passivity. When a protocol observer's notation file is cited in a legal dispute, which happens rarely, does happen, what it provides is the testimony of a trained, credentialed witness who was in the room and was watching and had no interest in the outcome. Disinterested accuracy, that is the service. To perform that service well, you have to develop a very particular relationship with the impulse to act. The job puts you in proximity to things. You observe negotiations that are unfair, and proceedings that are rigged, and transactions that benefit one party by taking from another, and you record them with the same clean, uncommitted attention you would bring to an entirely equitable proceeding, because your function is the recording, not the adjudication. The adjudication belongs to other offices. The record belongs to you. You are a witness, nothing more. 11 years of that turns you into a specific shape. I had that shape very thoroughly by the time I arrived on Sethari. Tolkas's compliment about the clean instrument panel was accurate. I had trained myself into an observer who produced clean records because I had learned, early and completely, that the cleanliness of the record was everything, and that any contamination of the record with the observer's own responses to what they were observing was a professional failure. I watched, I recorded, I did not respond. This is not, I want to be clear, a morally empty discipline. Is a version of it that sounds like ethical cowardice. Standing at the edge of rooms and watching things happen and filing your notation and going home. I do not think it is cowardice. I think it is a form of service that requires a degree of self-suppression that most people, if they attempted it, would find genuinely difficult. The observer's neutrality is not indifference. It is discipline in the service of accuracy. It matters that the record is clean. It matters that when the adjudicating offices go looking for an account of what happened, they find one that has not been bent by the witness's preferences. I believed in that. I still believe in it. What I also believe, and what Sethari taught me in a specific and irreversible way, is that discipline has an edge. At some point, the thing you are observing moves out of the range of the discipline's application. Not often. In 11 years, it happened once. But when it happens, the question is not whether you know the rules. You know the rules perfectly. The question is whether the rules still hold in the space you are standing in, with what you have in your pocket, and what is moving through the crowd 50 meters ahead of you. I want that on record, for what it is worth. It is probably worth less than it used to be. The planet Sethari is what the compact administrative glossaries call a Tier IV colonial settlement, world, fully inhabited, politically subordinate to the larger Tethani Outer Assembly, and in the slow, ungainly process of integration into the compact's commercial framework. In practical terms, this meant that Sethari was a world that had been settled by Tethani emigrants over roughly 200 years, had developed its own architecture and dialect and social memory, and was now subject to the decisions of a governing body 3 transit days away that only remembered Sethari existed when Sethari had something the assembly wanted. The cobblestones in the Mark district of the capital had been laid by Tethani settlers' hands. The copper-skinned faces in the windows above the market stalls were Tethani in every ancestral sense, but the assembly's legal reel extended to Sethari completely, which meant that when the assembly issued a ruling, Sethari received it whether or not Sethari had any say in the matter. I understood all of this in the abstract before I arrived. I understood it considerably better by the time I left. The delegation I was embedded with was a Grade 2 procurement delegation, led by a senior assembly factor named Goras Len, whose principal business on Sethari was negotiating the extraction rights for a mineral deposit in Sethari's southern continent. Goras Len was a tall man, deeply formal, possessed of the kind of self-assurance that comes not from confidence in one's own judgment, but from the complete certainty that one's judgment will never be questioned. He was not cruel in any active sense. He was the kind of man who does not see cruelty, because cruelty, in his experience, tends to happen at a distance that he is never required to close. I had been embedded with delegations like his before. You learn to stay out of their way, to file your notations cleanly, to be in the correct position at each formal proceeding so that your record of the event is legally unimpeachable. You learn that the delegation head does not want to know you are there, and that the best service you can render is perfect invisibility. I had mastered perfect invisibility. We arrived in Sethari on the 43rd day of the compact's administrative year, placed us in Sethari's late dry season. The capital, a city called Varath, by its inhabitants, and the Sethari Administrative Center in all. Official assembly documentation sat on a low plateau above a river valley, and in the dry season the dust came up from the valley floor and settled on everything, on the rooftops, on the awnings of the market stalls, on the cobblestones that ran in long curving lines through the oldest quarter of the city. The streets in the old quarter were narrow. The buildings on either side were 2 and 3 stories of pale stone. The windows fitted with wooden shutters painted in the dark ochre that seemed to be the color Sethari had decided to call its own. I mention the color because I can still see it. 11 years later, retired now, with an entirely different daily texture to my life. I can still close my eyes and see the particular shade of dark ochre on those shutters, and the pale stone of the walls, and the dust that settled on everything, and the copper faces of the people at the market stalls. Going about the business of a dry season morning, I did not know, when I first walked those streets at the start of the delegation's transit through the old quarter, that I would spend so much of the remainder of my life coming back to them in my memory. I did not know that the memory would always end at the same point, and that I would always be standing at the same street corner, watching the same small figure move away through the crowd, and not knowing. I still do not know. That is a fact I have arrived at a kind of peace with, though peace is perhaps the wrong word for it. Settled acceptance, maybe. The notation is in the record. What the notation did, beyond the 72 hours I can account for, is not in any record I have access to. But I am getting ahead of myself. I was trained to proceed in sequence. I should proceed in sequence. The delegation's schedule on Sethari called for 3 days of formal proceedings at the Assembly's administrative compound on the northern edge of the city, followed by a transit of the old market quarter for a formal reception at the colonial governor's residence, which sat at the far end of the quarter's main thoroughfare. The transit was, in diplomatic terms, ceremonial. Goras Len and his senior staff would walk the length of the main street, visible to the population, demonstrating the Assembly's engagement with the colonial world it administered. The population, for its part, was expected to be present and largely inert. I had observed a dozen such transits. They followed a consistent shape. The delegation moved in a loose column. flanked by security staff, preceded by a pair of protocol aides carrying the assembly's formal colors, and followed by the administrative support staff, of which I was nominally one, though my actual function was distinct from the others. Protocol observers do not carry colors or manage the delegation's correspondence. We walk at the column's outer edge, we watch, and we file. Transit began on schedule, at the 10th hour of Sethari's morning. The dry season sun was already high and hard, and the dust was already in the air, and the market quarter was already full of the sounds and movements of people who had been going about their business since before the delegation arrived, and would continue going about it long after the delegation left. This is one of the things I have always found clarifying about market quarters in colonial cities. They are fundamentally indifferent to the political events moving through them. The stalls open. The goods are displayed. The transactions occur. The delegation walks past, and the stallholders watch it with the expression of people who have watched many things walk past and found most of them less interesting than their inventory. The quarter's main thoroughfare was perhaps 12 meters wide between the building fronts, wide enough for the delegation's column, with some room on either side for the foot traffic of the morning. The buildings pressed close enough that their upper stories nearly met the light, and in the spaces between overhanging eaves, lines of drying cloth hung in the dry air, moving slightly in the warm wind that came off the valley. There was a particular quality to the light in those streets. The angle of the dry season sun filtering through the dust and the hanging cloth. Everything a shade warmer and softer than it would have been in cleaner air. It was not beautiful in any dramatic sense. It was the beauty of an inhabited place, going about its business, which is a quieter and more durable thing. The stallholders called out occasionally to the crowd and to each other. At one end of a side alley I passed, two older men were arguing about something in the colonial dialect of Tithani that I only partially understood. The vocabulary had diverged enough from the assembly's formal dialect that I caught the shape of the argument without the substance. A small animal of a species I did not recognize sat on a cloth at the base of one of the buildings, watching the delegation pass with the professional incuriosity of an animal that has decided humans are not, on balance, worth the energy of a reaction. I was watching the delegation's right flank, my standard position when I first saw the hunter unit. I say hunter unit because that is what they were, though they were not wearing anything that identified them as such. 3 individuals, moving in the crowd at roughly the pace of the delegation's transit, but slightly ahead of it, using the column's forward motion as cover. 2 men and 1 woman, dressed in the same plain colonial clothing as everyone else on the street. The loose, dust-colored fabric that Sethari's inhabitants favored in the dry season, but moving with the specific, unhurried purposefulness of people who have a destination and are not browsing. I noticed them because of how they moved relative to the crowd. In a market quarter, most people in motion are doing one of a handful of things: going somewhere specific and moving directly, browsing and moving slowly, or managing the competing demands of children and purchases and conversation. Hunter units in civilian clothing move differently from all of these. They maintain a consistent spatial relationship with one another without appearing to coordinate. They do not browse, but they also do not move in a straight line. They adjust subtly to maintain a sight line on something ahead of them, while keeping the crowd between themselves and whatever they're tracking. The thing they were tracking was a child. I saw her a moment after I identified the unit's movement pattern, because once I understood the triangulation of their positions, I understood what the apex of that triangle pointed at. She was small, even for a Tethani child, which is to say she was very small indeed, because Tethani children at that age are generally built along the lines of something fragile and deliberate, as though the body has decided to be careful before it commits to its full dimensions. Skin was the deep copper of old Sethari stock. The families that had been on the planet for 5 or 6 generations, their coloring a shade or two darker than the assembly-born Tethani, who made up Goris Len's delegation. Her hair was silver white and had been braided, though the braid was coming undone in the way that braids do on children who have been moving for a long time without anyone to retie them. She was wearing a tunic that was too large for her, in a faded blue-gray, that might once have been a brighter color, with bows patched in a darker fabric that didn't quite match. She was moving through the market crowd with the specific, controlled carefulness of a child who has learned that drawing attention is dangerous. Not running, not hurrying in any obvious way. Moving at the pace of the crowd, keeping to the middle density sections where there were enough bodies around her to reduce her visibility, but not so many that her movement would be impeded. She did not look back at the three people following her. She did not need to look back. The particular way she was navigating told me she already knew they were there. I have thought, many times since that morning, about what it costs a child to learn to move like that. To develop that instinct, the crowd reading, the sightline management, the steady pace that does not betray panic. Children who move like that have had occasion to learn it. They have been in situations more than once where the wrong kind of movement at the wrong moment produced consequences they needed to survive. It is not a skill that comes from happiness. It comes from the accumulated education of being hunted, and it sits in the body as a kind of permanent readiness that I do not think ever fully leaves. There is a specific thing that protocol work teaches you about the bodies of people under pressure, which is that pressure has a physical vocabulary that is almost impossible to fully suppress. Trained operatives manage it. Experienced officials manage it. Children, whose bodies have not yet developed the full repertoire of suppression, mostly do not manage it. Their fear shows in the shoulders, in the too straight posture that looks like calm but is actually held breath, in the eyes that move too regularly to be casual scanning. What I saw in the Tethani child was not the absence of fear but the management of it, and the management was good enough that most of the crowd around her would not have registered what I registered. Most of the crowd around her was not watching her. Most of the crowd was not trained to read the difference between ordinary movement and movement, that is doing work. I was watching her because I was watching the hunters, and the hunters defined the thing they were hunting. But as I watched, stopped thinking about her as the object of their attention and started seeing her as a person, managing an impossible situation with the limited tools available to her, which is to say with the only tool she had. Her own body's ability to move through a crowd without being the thing the crowd noticed most. She was doing it well. She was doing it better than most adults I have observed in equivalent situations. She was 11 years old. I estimated then, and the estimate was later confirmed in the relevant documentation that I reviewed after the fact. And she was doing it better than most adults. I know what she was because I knew the legal landscape of Sethari before we arrived. Compact protocol observers are required to brief themselves on the jurisdictional status of every world to which they are assigned. Sethari's jurisdictional status had a particular complication that I had noted in my pre-arrival briefing and filed in the standard category of political background context. 3 months before our delegation's visit, the Tethani Outer Assembly had issued Citizenship Ordinance 7 Provisional, which revised the legal classification of Tethani nationals residing in colonial territories under Assembly administration. The ordinance's practical effect, stripped of its administrative language, was this: Tethani citizens born in colonial territories who had not been formally registered with the Assembly's Citizenship Bureau, which required a physical filing at an Assembly administrative office, a fee that amounted to roughly 3 months of wages for a colonial laborer, and documentation that many colonial families did not possess, were reclassified as undetermined status colonial residents. Tethani minors, in that classification, the ordinance it further specified, were subject to provisional custodial assignment, which meant that the Assembly's Bureau of Colonial Integration could transfer legal guardianship of such minors to Assembly-designated institutions, integration and development purposes. I had read what those institutions were. Do not include that here, because the details are not necessary to understand what I did and why. It is sufficient to say that the institutions were not schools, and the integration they offered was not education, and the development they were interested in was not the kind that benefits the child. The ordinance had been in legal challenge before the Compact Review Panel for 2 of its 3 months of existence. The challenge had not yet produced a stay of enforcement. This meant the ordinance was active law. The hunters were legal operatives. The proceeding they were conducting was a lawful proceeding, under a law that had not yet been nullified. This is the specific quality of the trap. Everything they were doing was legal. I understood that clearly, watching them work through the crowd. The ordinance had been drafted carefully by people who understood how to draft ordinances, and it had been issued through the proper channels, and the Bureau of Colonial Integration had sent properly credentialed operatives to execute it. There was nothing irregular about the proceeding in any sense the law currently recognized. The only thing that was irregular was what the law had decided to call a child. I had read all of this. I had noted it in my pre-arrival context file. I had not thought, reading it, that I would walk through a market street and watch it operate on a specific child. This is something I have come to understand about administrative cruelty. It is very easy to process it as information. Numbers and classifications and legal language sit in the mind as abstractions. A file entry that reads, "Undetermined status colonial residence subject to provisional custodial assignment," does not, in the abstract, convey the weight of a copper-skinned child with a silver braid coming undone. Moving through a dusty market crowd at a controlled and careful pace, 3 people closing the distance behind her. I watched the unit work the crowd. They were good at it. Not exceptional, competent in the way that institutional operatives tend to be competent. Trained to a standard, reliable within their parameters, unlikely to improvise. The woman on the unit's left flank was the most skilled. She was adjusting her pace to the crowd's micro-fluctuations, in a way that the 2 men were not quite managing, told me she had more field experience. The man on the right flank was the most physically imposing, told me his function was containment rather than tracking. The man in the center was the unit lead. He was the one whose line of sight on the child never wavered for more than a few seconds at a time. They were going to close the distance within the next 3 or 4 minutes. The child was good, but the market ahead of her was thinning. The main thoroughfare opened, about 150 meters ahead, into a wider plaza where the density of the crowd would drop sharply. In the plaza, the unit could move faster. In the plaza, there would be nowhere for her to absorb herself into the human texture of the street. I had about 4 minutes. I want to be precise about what I was thinking in those 4 minutes, because I have been asked, subsequently, and in various contexts, whether I acted impulsively. The answer is no. I am not an impulsive person. I had spent 11 years doing a job that required me to be the opposite of impulsive. To observe without intervening, record without participating, to maintain the specific kind of disciplined non-action. That is the protocol observer's fundamental professional posture. What I did in those 4 minutes was think carefully and quickly about what instruments I had available to me, what their legal parameters were, what the costs of using them would be, and whether I was willing to pay those costs. The instrument is called a witness notation of pending irregularity. It is a formal filing mechanism available exclusively to active compact protocol observers, and it has a specific and narrow application. When a protocol observer, in the course of their observation duties, identifies an action or proceeding that may constitute a violation of active compact review, panel challenges, or applicable compact framework tests, protections, they may file a witness notation that attaches to the relevant proceeding and triggers mandatory compact legal review before any further action in that proceeding may be taken. The word proceeding is the operative one. In the ordinance's language, provisional custodial assignment was a formal proceeding of the Colonial Integration Bureau. A hunter unit closing on a minor for the purpose of executing a provisional custodial assignment was, legally, conducting a proceeding. A witness notation of pending irregularity, once filed, froze the proceeding for a minimum of 72 hours, while the Compact Legal Review Bureau processed the challenge. During those 72 hours, no action in the proceeding could be taken. The child could not be touched. I was a protocol observer embedded with a Grade 2 procurement delegation. The witness notation mechanism existed to allow protocol observers to flag legal irregularities in proceedings involving the delegations to which they were assigned. I was not attached to the Colonial Integration Bureau's proceedings. I was not assigned to observe the hunter unit. The witness, notation's application to this situation required an interpretive stretch of the mechanism's standard usage that I was entirely certain my bureau would not endorse. The interpretive stretch was this. The provision had never, in the history of compact protocol service, been used to file a notation on a proceeding entirely unrelated to the filing observer's assigned delegation. Provision existed to catch collateral irregularities, situations where a delegation's activities intersected with other legally contested proceedings. It had never been read to create a general warrant for protocol observers to intervene in independent proceedings simply because those proceedings were occurring nearby. Compact protocol observers are not, in the language of the service's governing regulations, empowered to intervene in proceedings outside the scope of their assigned delegation's activities. They are, however, and this is the provision that I had located in my memory within the first 40 seconds of identifying the situation, permitted to file a witness notation on any formal compact framework proceeding that occurs within their physical observation radius during the exercise of their observation duties, where that proceeding involves an active compact review panel challenge. The observer's radius is defined as the physical area in which the observer can make a standard observation at the time of filing. I was conducting my standard observation of the delegation's transit of the market quarter. The market quarter was my current observation radius. Citizenship Ordinance 7 Provisional was the subject of an active compact review panel challenge. The Hunter Unit was executing a proceeding under Citizenship Ordinance 7 Provisional. I was a protocol observer. I had the physical legal standing to file. The stretch in the reading, the part that would not survive bureau scrutiny, was the question of whether my jurisdiction as a protocol observer extended to proceedings that had no relationship to my assigned delegation's activities. The provision said, any formal compact framework proceeding. My bureau would say the any was contextually bounded by the assignment scope. Would say the any meant what it said. We would both be reading the same text. My bureau would have the authority to determine which reading prevailed. My bureau would read it that way. My bureau would read it exactly that way. And they would be correct within their interpretive authority. And the finding would be that I had exceeded my authority in a manner that constituted a disqualifying abuse of the witness notation mechanism, and my protocol certification would be revoked. To be honest about what 11 years of protocol service means, because it is easy to describe the abstract it actually was. The certification was not merely a credential. It was the thing that had structured my entire adult life. The early years of training, the first postings, the slow accumulation of a record that justified the next level of assignment and the next after. The particular satisfaction which I had never found elsewhere, of standing in rooms where consequential things happened, and knowing with complete confidence that your record of those rooms was accurate. The knowledge that the record you built outlasted the events themselves, that the notation file existed as a permanent, reliable account of what had occurred, independent of who wanted to remember it differently, that mattered to me. The mattering was not small. I was going to lose it. I knew that with the same precision with which I knew the legal parameters of the instrument in my hand. The career was going to end on Sethari. In a dusty market quarter, over a notation my bureau would spend approximately 48 hours voiding. The notation would still be valid for 72 hours, 48 to void and 72 to freeze. The math was not complicated. I took out my notation stylus. It was a compact issue instrument, gray metal, engraved with my observer identification number, the kind of object that has been in your pocket for so long you stop noticing it. I had never used one in a way that made my hands feel anything. That morning, holding it, I was aware of a faint tremor in my fingers that I identified, after a moment's attention, as the particular physical sensation of making an irreversible decision. The notation form was preloaded in the stylus's interface. I filled it in as I walked, because I was still walking, still maintaining my position at the column's right flank, still doing my job as far as the delegation was concerned. The form required, the nature of the irregularity, the specific provision of the compact framework engaged, the identifier of the proceeding being flagged, and the observer's certification of standing. filled in all 4 fields. The third field, the proceeding identifier, required me to name the Colonial Integration Bureau action by its formal Ordinance 7 Provisional Classification Code, which I had memorized from my pre-arrival briefing, along with everything else I had read and thought I would not need. I remember thinking, filling in that field, that there is something almost formal about the way preparation pays off. I'd read the ordinance because reading things carefully is what I do. I had retained the classification code because I retained details of that kind as a professional habit. I had not known, reading it, that the code would need to come out of my memory on a dry season morning in a colonial market quarter, entered into a notation form while I was walking at a delegation's flank with my hands slightly unsteady and a child 50 meters ahead of me with 3 minutes left. I completed the form, my thumb held over the filing confirmation. The Tathani child had reached the edge of the thinning section of the market, another 30 or 40 meters, and she would be in the open plaza. The unit lead had shortened his distance to perhaps 25 meters behind her. The woman on the left flank had repositioned slightly, widening her angle of approach to cut off a potential escape to the left side of the plaza's entrance. They were good. They had done this before. Pressed the confirmation. There is no sound when a witness notation files. The stylus interface confirms the submission with a small, steady light, green, in the compact's color system for received and registered. And that is all. No announcement. No visible change in the street around me. The delegation continued its transit. The market continued its morning. The dust continued to settle on the dark ochre shutters. The unit lead stopped. It was not an obvious stop. It was the stop of someone who has received a notification through an earpiece. A very slight pause in the motion. A momentary stillness in the jaw. Kind of micro-expression adjustment that happens when the body is processing information that the face is not yet authorized to show. He received the notification for perhaps 2 seconds. Then he looked up, and his eyes moved across the crowd. And I did not allow my eyes to meet his because I was watching the delegation's right flank, and I was a protocol observer doing my job. And I was entirely invisible. His eyes did not find me. Why would they? I was nobody. I was a uniformed administrative functionary at the edge of a Grade 2 procurement delegation ceremonial transit. I was 4,000 unremarkable notations in a registry that nobody read. I watched, from the corner of my vision that I keep trained for peripheral observation, as he made a small gesture to the left flank woman. She stopped. The right flank man, slightly slower, stopped a moment later. The 3 of them stood in the crowd, no longer moving, no longer triangulated. The unit lead said something quiet that I could not hear. The woman's expression did not change. The right flank man turned his body slightly, facing away from the plaza ahead, which is the stance you take when you are standing down. They had been notified. The notification, per the mechanism's protocol, went to the proceedings originating bureau, and the bureau was required to notify the parties engaged in executing the proceeding. The notification said, in the compact's formal language, that a witness notation of pending irregularity had been filed against the current proceeding, and that all actions under the proceeding were suspended pending compact legal review, which would be initiated within 6 standard hours, and would require a minimum of 72 hours to process. The unit could not touch her, not until the review concluded, and the review, given the challenge already pending before the panel, take considerably longer than 72 hours to produced a determination that would override the notation's protection. I did not look at the child. I kept my eyes on the delegation's right flank, and I kept walking. I know that she was still moving. I registered her motion in the same peripheral field where I had been tracking the unit, and I know that she did not stop because she did not know what had happened and had no reason to stop. She was a child in a crowd, moving away from danger at a careful, controlled pace, not running, not drawing to tension, doing everything right. The plaza opened ahead of the delegation. The unit stood somewhere behind me, not moving. I completed the transit at the delegation's right flank. Heard my report of the day's proceedings, the standard delegation transit notation, the ceremonial markers, the governor's reception, formal exchange of the mineral extraction documents, at the end of the day's official schedule. I filed it cleanly and completely, as I always did. I did not include the witness notation of pending irregularity in the daily record. It was already in the system through the independent notification channel and did not require secondary notation. The summons from Tolvin Cassie arrived the following morning. I should say something about what the intervening night was like, between the filing and the summons, because I think it is relevant to understanding why I am able to say what I am going to say about the outcome. I did not sleep well. I am generally a reasonable sleeper. I have the sort of constitution that does not produce insomnia under normal stress. But that night, I was awake for a considerable portion of the dark hours, lying in the delegation's accommodation block, listening to the dry season wind move through the city outside, and attending to the specific quality of the knowledge that I had done something irreversible. It is a particular kind of knowledge. I suspect it is more common than people acknowledge. Most irreversible things do not feel irreversible at the moment of their doing. They feel like decisions which the mind experiences as ongoing, is to say, as things that could in principle be revisited. The actual quality of the irreversible only lands afterward, in the quiet, when the action is complete, and the mind finally stops presenting it as a live option and starts presenting it as a fixed point. This is the thing I have done. This point is now behind me. The trajectory of my life now passes through this point, not before it. I lay awake with that knowledge, and I let it settle. I thought about the 4 minutes. I thought about the form fields. I thought about the green confirmation light. I thought about the moment the unit lead had stopped. I thought about the provision I had used. I thought about the word any in the text of the provision, any formal compact framework proceeding, and about the fact that I had used a reading, any, that I was entirely certain my bureau would not confirm, and about whether that certainty was a sign that I had been wrong to use it or a sign that the provision should have been read that way all along, and my bureau's narrower reading was the error. I am trained in legal text. I know how provisions work. I know that any is not infinitely extensible and that context shapes its reach. I know all of this. I also know that the provision was drafted by people who, at the time of drafting, were attempting to give protocol observers the maximum legal leverage to protect the integrity of proceedings in complex jurisdictional environments, and that a colonial world under an active challenge proceeding is exactly the kind of complex jurisdictional environment that leverage was meant for. I did not resolve this argument in my own favor lying there in the dark. I held it open. I am a protocol observer. I was a protocol observer, and we are not in the business of resolving the cases in which we are interested parties. I was the interested party. The Bureau would make the determination. I already knew what the determination would be. I lay awake for several hours and then, somewhere in the depth of the night, I slept. Tolvin Cass contacted me through the secure protocol channel at the 7th hour. He was calm, which I had expected. Tolvin Cass was a man who expressed displeasure through an extremely controlled and deliberate precision of language, rather than through any elevation of tone. He told me that my notation had been received and flagged. He told me that the Bureau's initial reading of the provision I had cited found my standing to be arguably extenuant, which is Bureau language for almost certainly invalid. But we are not yet comfortable putting that in writing. He told me that a formal review of my standing would be conducted, and that I should expect a determination within 10 to 15 standard days. He told me, very precisely, that the notations freeze was active, and that it could not be voided prior to the standing determination, because voiding a notation from a still certified observer required a finding of standing invalidity, and the finding had not yet been made. He told me, with the particular emphasis of a man communicating something he could not state directly, that the Bureau found my conduct significantly irregular, and that I should consider carefully what the review process would reveal about the pattern of my professional judgment. This was Tolvin Cass's way of telling me that the outcome was decided and that I had the option, for the formal determination, of resigning with a neutral record, rather than waiting for the revocation and a record that noted the revocations. He was being, in his way, kind. I had worked for him for 11 years. He thought he was giving me a path to preserve something. I thanked him. I told him I would consider it carefully. I did not tell him that I had already considered everything carefully, on a dry season street with 4 minutes and a notation stylus, and that there was nothing left to consider. We completed the delegation schedule, 3 more days of formal proceedings, a transit back through the administrative compound, the mineral extraction documents signed and witnessed. I did my job cleanly. I filed my daily records. I did not speak to anyone about the notation. On the delegation's final morning in Varath, I walked the old market quarter alone before the day's schedule began, not as part of any official function, just walking. The market was already open. The stallholders were already arranging their goods in the slant of the early light. The dark ochre shutters were the same color they had been every other morning. The cobblestones were smooth and pale and dusty. I walked the route the delegation's transit had taken, from the entrance of the old quarter to the plaza. I walked it slowly, as though I could recover from the stones some information about what had happened after the transit passed. I could not, of course. The stones did not record anything. The stallholders who had been working that morning had their own lives and their own work, and were not attendants to the particular drama that had moved through their street. I stood for several minutes in the spot where, 3 days before, I had pressed the confirmation on my notation stylus. I looked at the section of the crowd where the child had been. I looked at the entrance to the plaza ahead. I did not know if she had made it. I stood there long enough that a woman running a spice stall 3 meters away started watching me, with the expression of someone trying to determine whether a stopped stranger requires attention. I moved on before she could make a decision about it. The delegation departed Sathari that afternoon. The Bureau's formal determination came 11 days later. The language was precise and final. My standing to file the notation had been found invalid, on the grounds that the proceeding I had flagged fell outside the jurisdiction of my assigned and that the provision I had cited did not extend to independent proceedings of unrelated administrative bureaus occurring within the observer's physical radius. The notation itself had been valid for the duration prior to the standing determination, which meant the 72 hours had stood. The determination voided the notation prospectively, meaning from the moment of the determination, not retroactively. My certification was revoked coincident with the determination. The Bureau offered, through Tolvin Cassie, the option of a neutral departure record if I accepted the revocation without contest. I accepted it without contest. I was no longer a compact protocol observer. I want to be accurate about the period that followed, because I think there is a version of this story in which what happened next was defined primarily by loss or regret, and I do not believe that is the accurate account. I had lost my position. I had lost 11 years of career investment. I had lost the thing I had been good at, the watching, the recording, the clean invisible work of standing at the edge of rooms and knowing what was happening in them. These were real losses, and I did not pretend otherwise. The first months were not comfortable. I am not a person who requires external validation to feel competent, but I am a person who had organized the entire rhythm of their adult life around a specific professional function, and the abrupt removal of that function left a shape in the days that I did not know how to fill. Did clerical work for a time, through a placement service, in an administrative office that processed cargo manifests for inner belt freight operations. The work was not interesting. The people were not unpleasant. I was diligent and competent and invisible, which are qualities that serve well in cargo manifest processing. And I spent 3 years doing it before moving into a different kind of administrative work that suited me somewhat better. I did not, during this period, contact anyone at the Compact Protocol Service. I did not contest the revocation. I did not write to Tolvin Cass, who had offered the neutral record as a kindness, and who would not, I judged, find it useful to receive correspondence from the person whose misuse of a mechanism he had administered for 30 years had become a minor citation in the Bureau's disciplinary case history. I let the connection end cleanly. It seemed appropriate, given the 11 years I had spent doing clean endings. But I had also, in the remaining 72 hours before the Bureau's determination voided, the notation created a window of time in which a child with a silver braid and a patched tunic had not been touched by anyone who wanted to take her somewhere. What happened in that window was not something I could know. 72 hours is a specific measure of time. It is enough time, in a city the size of Varath, for a great many things to happen or fail to happen. I had no way to access any information about the Colonial Integration Bureau's subsequent actions, or about the whereabouts of a specific unregistered Tethani minor, who had been the subject of a provisional custodial assignment proceeding that had been frozen for 72 hours and then unfrozen. I had bought time. Whether the time had been enough was a question I could not answer. I have thought about this question for 11 years, which is, to say, for exactly as long as I had previously spent as a protocol observer, which is a symmetry I find neither meaningful nor meaningless, simply coincidental. The kind of thing the mind notices and the world does not intend. In the first years after Setheri, I thought about it frequently and with the specific texture of unresolvable uncertainty. The answer might be yes, it might be no, and there was no path to knowing which. This kind of uncertainty is uncomfortable, in a way that is distinct from other kinds, when the uncertain thing is behind you and fixed. When the outcome has already occurred but is simply unknown to you, the mind tends to reach for it repeatedly, as though a fresh attempt at reaching might somehow reveal what previous reaches have not. It does not work that way. The outcome does not become knowable through repetition of the question. But the mind tries anyway, because the mind is built for patterns, and cannot quite accept that some patterns end in blank. I have, over time, become more comfortable with the blank. Not through an discipline or philosophy, just through the ordinary passage of years, which has a way of wearing down the urgency of questions that cannot be answered without answering them. The question is still there. I still return to it. I returned to it this morning, which is why I am writing this now, which is not something I do often or have ever shown to anyone. There is a detail I did not include in the formal record I left with the Bureau when certification was revoked. The Bureau's record of the notation includes all the legally relevant facts, the form fields, the filing time, provision cited, the proceeding identifier, the standing determination, the revocation. It does not include what I saw after I pressed the confirmation, because what I saw after I pressed the confirmation was not part of the notation's formal content. It was simply what happened. What happened was this: for approximately 4 seconds, before the unit lead received his notification and stopped, the child reached the edge of the thinning section of the market and turned her head slightly to the left. A small, quick movement, the kind of unconscious scanning that a child in her situation performs constantly. Scan swept the crowd at the angle that would cover, among other directions, the position where I was walking at the delegation's right flank. For those 4 seconds, as my confirmation light came on green and the notation registered, the child's pale gray eyes moved across the section of the crowd where I was. I do not know if she saw me. I was in uniform, gray, unremarkable, and I was doing nothing that would have drawn her attention, and her scan was a practical security sweep, and not a deliberate look at any individual. There was no reason for her to see me specifically, but I have carried those 4 seconds for 11 years. The timing of them. The fact that he moves across the space I occupied at the precise moment the confirmation light came on, before anyone else in the street knew anything had changed. The way the mind, encountering a coincidence of timing at a moment of great personal weight, tends to make it significant even when there is no ground for significance. I know there is no ground for significance. She was scanning the crowd. I was one of several hundred people in the crowd. The timing was coincidence. I carry it anyway. It is a very light thing to carry as these things go. Lighter than the question, which sits heavier. Lighter than the not knowing, sits heavier still. The formal record says, witness notation of pending irregularity filed by Observer P. Avari, Compact Protocol Service, D77044, certification active at time of filing. Against Colonial Integration Bureau proceeding under Ordinance 7 Provisional Classification Code, CI-7P Maka, Varath Administrative District Setheri, notification issued to proceeding parties. Proceeding actions suspended 72 hours. Observer standing subsequently determined invalid. Notation voided prospectively at determination date. Observer certification revoked. It is a clean record as records go. All the facts present, the form fields correct, the language precise. It does not say that a woman with a blue-gray tunic and a silver braid coming undone walked out of a market quarter on a dry season morning and did not look back, and that I watched her go, and that she got smaller as the distance between us increased, and then she was in the crowd in a way that was different from how she had been in the crowd before. Not visible among others, but simply gone, absorbed, no longer an individual figure I could track. One moment there, the next moment part of the crowd itself, indistinguishable, present, everywhere and nowhere. The record does not say that I stood at the corner of the main thoroughfare and the plaza for the time it took the delegation to move 20 meters ahead of me, and that I did not move to follow it immediately, which was a small dereliction of my position that no one noticed because nobody was watching me. The record does not say that I looked at the place where she had been and felt a precision that surprised me. Given the practical nature of my training, something very close to the specific variety of hope that is not optimism, the kind that does not require a favorable outcome to exist, sits in the chest independent of what it expects and says only, it is possible. I have tried over the years to determine, through publicly available records, whether Ordinance 7 Provisional was eventually struck down by the Compact Review Panel. It was, as it happens. The panel issued a full nullification ruling 14 months after my notation, finding the ordinance incompatible with 3 separate compact framework protections for civilian, minor status individuals in colonial territories. The Colonial Integration Bureau's provisional custodial assignment proceedings were voided in their entirety, and the Bureau's minor status custodial program was dissolved. This is a matter of public record. It is the kind of thing that, in the account of events, might seem to settle something. The panel ruling vindicating the challenge, the ordinance struck down, the program dissolved. It does not settle the question I have. The question I have is specific and individual, and not addressed by any panel ruling or Bureau dissolution. It is addressed only by what happened in 72 hours in a colonial city, on a planet. I left the afternoon of the day the delegation completed. Schedule. 14 months is a long time. 72 hours is a shorter time. What the 72 hours purchased for a specific child, and whether the purchase was enough, is not in the panel's ruling, or in the Bureau's dissolution order, or in any document to which I have access. I am retired now. I live in a small apartment in one of the Compact's inner belt administrative centers. Not a place of any particular character, neither ugly nor beautiful. The kind of city that has all the things a city requires, and none of the things that make you remember it was a city. I have a window that faces east, and in the mornings, the light comes through it in a way that is nothing at all like the dry season light on the pale stone of Sathari's market quarter, but that I sometimes stand in for longer than I intend to, doing nothing in particular. Do not regret filing the notation. I want to say that cleanly, without qualifying it. I had a career that I valued, and that is over, and the occasion of its ending was a decision I made in 4 minutes on a dry season street with my hands slightly unsteady, and I do not regret it. It was built to serve the Compact's framework for the protection of legitimate proceedings. The notation was an act of service to the Compact's framework for the protection of legitimate proceedings. These two things are not in conflict. Whatever the Bureau's standing determination said, I hold them without conflict. What I hold with something other than peace, not distress exactly, not grief, but a kind of permanent incompleteness, is the not knowing. There is a child, or there is someone who was once a child, somewhere in the galaxy or not, and I do not know which. And I did a thing that may or may not have changed which one is true. That is all I know. That is what the record does not say. That is why the notation is in the file under unattributed civic observation, a notation that does not explain itself, that sits in the record with all its facts intact, and none of its reason visible, waiting for a reader who will find it unremarkable, as all my other notations have been unremarkable, as 4,017 small acts of careful watching and recording generally are. 4,017 notations. One of them I will not explain. I filed it for a child who moved through a crowd with controlled and careful steps and turned her eyes across the space I occupied for 4 seconds on a dry season morning, and then was part of the crowd, and then was gone. I filed it knowing what it cost. I filed it because I had the instrument and the moment and the legal standing that was arguably extenuant and the 4 minutes that were exactly enough. I would file it again. I would file it in 3 minutes if that were the window. I would file it with no minutes left if the stylus moved fast enough. That is not a regret. That is the statement of a man who knows what he had in his pocket and knows what he used it for. The notation is in the record. The rest is hers.